Welcome back for this last session. You have heard great things about great frameworks and what you should use now to build an awesome app, but you want to build a billion dollar app.
Billion dollar,
yeah.
not million dollar.
Million is like, yeah, go home, crap stuff. That's not worth your time or mine. So we got a guy here that knows how to do that. Georg Berkowski, he's going to tell you how to build a $1 billion app. Yeah.
Thank you. So again, first of all, thanks so much for staying on a Friday afternoon, right? I appreciate that there are so many better things, including beer. I'd rather be drinking a beer than listening to me, except if you haven't actually heard or seen my book. I spent a good year and a half of my life talking to all the guys, all 13 mobile-first $1 billion apps, to really understand what was their story. How do they really do it? And this is not the story of what we see in the media and basically all the rubbish, but what actually did it take to build a $1 billion business or a multi-billion dollar business straight off the back of mobile apps. And I have some okay experiences as well. I've built one that's worth about $500 million that just got acquired by Daimler-Benz, so that's okay. One of the biggest taxi apps in Europe, and now it's joined with My Taxi, a nice German outfit, and owned by Daimler, which is kind of cool, but nothing on the order of what some of these other guys have really achieved. I work quite closely with the guys at Candy Crush. They've invested in our new business, which is sort of on the doing some really interesting facial recognition and live face tracking stuff that you've probably seen before. But what I really want to sort of start off with is a little bit of a personal journey, and this is not just about $1 billion apps and $1 billion businesses and how mobile has fundamentally changed the way that we create them, but it's equally about the people and their stories and how they did things right and wrong in order to get there. Because 50% of this is about building the right thing at the right time, and 50% of it is someone who got to the right time at the right place with the right team and built the right thing. So it sounds all quite convoluted, but I'm sure the story will get a lot clearer. So I started out actually with a huge passion in space, and I promise you this is all relevant. I used to be a rocket scientist at MIT when I started and when I went to college, and one of my dreams was to go to space and to be an astronaut. But when you find out the reality of 4,000 people applying for 2 jobs every 8 to 10 years, you realize that that's all bullshit and impossible, and you can't be an astronaut, so don't tell your kids they can be astronauts, because it's a bit of a lie. But being an entrepreneur at heart, I went to a conference not too dissimilar to this many years ago, and I met some guys who put that logo on the side of a Russian rocket. And they said, you know what? We're going to invest $80 million and own that. And in fact, they did. And it was a crazy American entrepreneur called Walt Anderson who made his money. And he's not a technical entrepreneur, but he still made hundreds of millions of dollars. How did he make money? 1-900 cosmic hotlines and astrology numbers in the 90s. Great way to make money, right? People call up and want to know their future. And he, along with the company, we were owners of the Mir for a short amount of time and wanted to change that into a space hotel. We sent up a mission. We had Mir Corp astronauts. I ended up working for this company for a while. And we sent this guy, did we just lose the mic? I'm coming in and out. We sent this guy as the first commercial space tourist into space. The guy paid $35 million, was going in the middle of a divorce, had to mortgage his house in California because he's a good American and a good entrepreneur as well, a guy called Dennis Tito. And we sent him up to space on a Russian rocket. He came back and he survived. And lo and behold, this whole generation of human space travel for people who are not government officials, who are not test pilots, was born. And this really got me so excited about the whole entrepreneurial world, because there were people out there who everyone told them they were an idiot, that this was impossible. And yet they persevered and they made it through. They believed in their ridiculously silly idea that they could actually send fee-paying individuals to space. And to sort of cap off the story, this guy came to us. Anyone recognize this guy? I hope not. Maybe the women in the room should recognize him, but maybe the men shouldn't. We've already talked about boy bands, but he's Lance Bass, the lead singer or one of the singers in NSYNC. And we actually worked with him to send him into space with the Russians. Again, something that seemed so impossible. And it all fell apart as well. So irrespective of the 3 space tourists that we did end up sending into space, we also failed with him. But to me, that's actually, and this was my second job out of university working with this company, told me that actually, you know what, if you don't believe in the impossible and the ridiculous, then you have absolutely no chance of achieving it. So hold that thought, because it is actually the people who, you know, are the renegades and the black sheep who actually make these companies successful. So 27, interesting number. We're going back to apps right now. 27 is the number of apps the average person uses per month. Okay, the world has changed in the short time span that we've had apps since mid-2007 and then the first iPhone, right? We haven't even hit 10 years of apps, you know, barely 9 years really when we start talking about it. You know, really even 8 years when you just really think about when the App Store started going. And yet, we've hit a plateau with the number of apps that actually people use. And when you think about the millions of apps that are out there, about 5 or 6 million in total, depending on how you count it, you actually have a huge challenge, because out of all those millions, we all still only use 26 or 27 a month. Here's the really scary number that should depress everybody in the room, but the mood will go up after this. 0 is the average number of apps the average person downloads per month. Okay? It's really weird. It doesn't make any sense, right? We're downloading more apps than ever before, but yet the average person, all 65% of people, download 0 apps. The rest of us download, you know, quite a few per month. What does that mean about human behavior? It means we've hit this plateau, right? We've hit this world where the best apps and the best companies are actually consuming huge amounts of our time. We've decided which social networks we want to use. We've decided which chat apps we want to use. We've decided which calendar, email, everything. We've more or less decided, or at least a massive majority of people have. And that is why, oh, is it dead?
Yes. May I quickly change it?
Go on.
Thanks.
Cool, we back?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So this is one of the most critical things to really keep in mind is understand your audience, understand users and what's happening with the market. Here's the other absolutely absurd number. 42% of people's time, on average, is spent in their favorite app. Doesn't make any sense, does it? You know, 27 apps per month, 0 new apps downloaded, and 42% of our time in our favorite app. And here's the most depressing number, or exciting number, apart from 0, is who actually owns all the top apps. You know, between Google and Facebook and Yahoo, all of our attention in the attention economy has been consumed, purchased, and acquired by them. We're at a different point in the world of apps and their evolution. So if you're making an app now and want to create $1 billion business, the way that you think has to be completely different from the way that a lot of people thought even just a few years ago. You know, it's basically what we're dealing with. But yeah, there's still a bit of hope. And I think using the kind of intellect that engineers like all you guys have is really understanding where the next kind of opportunity can come from. And even when you look at this company, and actually if you look at the black curve, that's a new mysterious question mark company and mobile app. But the growth rate on the bottom is that of Facebook in its first 3 years. And this company completely eclipsed what Facebook was even capable of doing. And another example I'll show you will eclipse that even again. So it is still possible, but again, you have to really think differently. It's these guys, right? Who has not used Uber? Wow, really? Fantastic. So a company, you know, good old Uber, worth $65 billion that made $10 billion in gross revenues, probably about 2-3 billion net last year, has exploded onto the scene with something as basic as taxis and transportation. But again, that's not the way that Silicon Valley companies think. You know, these guys spread to 60 countries, 300 cities. But one of their models, and this is something to really keep in mind, is their product has evolved and changed and adapted from the very first city that it launched in. It is actually an app and a service that changes quite fundamentally depending on where you are in the world. And that's one of the huge advantages, is it isn't like Candy Crush, which is the same game, played by 120 million people every single day, which is such a waste of brain cycles. And so sad for the world, but so wonderful for one of my investors, Riccardo Zacconi, who made £700 million out of that deal, but that's okay. But Uber's different, right? Their whole play is around data. They understand where we move, how we behave, how cities are organized. They understand our habits, right? There are scary things that Uber knows that we at Halo knew as well. You know, we know where you live, right? Because that's where you take the taxi home to. We know where you work, because that's another high frequency point. We know that if you go to a weird house at midnight on a weekend and it's not your home, that there's a high likelihood of divorce coming. We know a lot about you because of your movements and mobility, and this has not been lost on Uber at all, except it has been lost on the clicker. One of the most interesting things about Uber and about a handful of businesses that started off in mobile is that they not only understand your location and travel with you, but they have, you know, a real secret weapon. And one of the tools that Uber has at their disposal, and again, remember, a mobile company, as you guys all know, the mobile app is just merely scratching the surface. It's the element that all the users play with, but the business behind it is fundamentally huge and different. It's almost like the top of an iceberg. They have a tool called Morpheus, right? This really doesn't work. They have a back end called Morpheus, and they've got this thing called the God View, which allows anyone who has access to it to look at all the data around the world. This is really kind of NSA level stuff, except in some ways, you know, much better because they've got your payment information, your credit card number, and everything else. But what they've been able to do is they can model all kinds of behavior. They have 18 full-time economists on their team that can model and figure out what you're going to do next. And one of the most creepy and horrible things is, and I use Uber a lot, is they have this thing that they've been fighting with the public about for their first sort of 5-6 years of existence, is surge pricing. And from a purely objective economic model, it makes sense. When more people want taxis at 7 p.m. or 11 p.m. on a Saturday night, let's jack up the price. And, you know, it's an incentive for more drivers to get on the road, and it's a disincentive for people, so the market will settle in the right place. But here's the bit is, what if they're manipulating this? And there's some really interesting data in a few interesting articles, because they understand now, kind of like Facebook, kind of like Google, they've got signals. They know when you open it and there's surge pricing. They know whether you're going to actually request a taxi and complete a ride or request a car or not. They understand everything about your likelihood to pay. That's why they've been able to maximize on the revenue front. So when you think about it, this is no longer just an app company or a mobile company. This is a whole different way of thinking about a mobility business with the data that they get at hand. So it sort of made me laugh when in the early days of Halo, we launched our app and we sort of scaled it to 13 cities around the world. And I see these ads for mobile developer wanted to create Uber or Halo-like app. We'll offer or we'll pay $5,000 US. And I'm like, that's really interesting. You know, people still think it's just captivated in this client. It's actually the data and understanding people's behavior and the business behind that that has allowed these guys to fundamentally explode. You know, they're not just apps. And yet, you know, and again, even in the few years they've been around, when they launched UberX, you know, Uber, like everyone else, started off with private cars, with taxis. Then they launched UberX, which was a completely new phenomenon, which is you and me getting in our car without a license, opening up a driver app, and getting paid to go pick up some friends. Because, in fact, there isn't typically enough supply of taxis or private cars in any city. And so that's a huge amount of the problems legally that those guys have got into. That was a huge way of actually cannibalizing their own business. UberX grew very quickly to be more than 30% of their revenue. And yet, in the last 18 months, they've created another business, which is called Uber Pool, which is further making the economic model even more interesting. With all this data, with so many users, these guys have figured out how one driver can always have a passenger in the back of his car. So I get on, then he picks up someone else along the way, then he drops me off, then someone else gets picked up. There's always someone in the car. It's more efficient. Why is that interesting? Because you actually pay 20, 30, 40% less than even an UberX journey. Why is that important? Because no one else can compete with that price differential. And so now, in just 18 months, that's more than 20% of their $10 billion turnover business. Even the scariest bit about this whole kind of phenomenon is they're actually using this data to sell into cities, into urban planners, and tell them how Uber Pool, because of its efficiency, can fundamentally reduce traffic and is actually better for cities, which actually completely supports their argument for driverless vehicles because it reduces traffic and therefore pollution and therefore costs and makes people and their gross national happiness and their sort of happiness quotient much higher. So these guys have actually built what was such a simple mobile app day one into one of the most cunning, well-ingrained businesses out there. And if you think about it that way, why wouldn't it be a $100 billion business like Facebook when it IPO'd? And when you think about it, not only in different cities, but they have motorbikes, in Thailand, they've got rickshaws in India, and they've got helicopters in Monaco. They adapt to every single market that they're in. So again, the big point of that is cannibalize yourself, as Steve Jobs famously said, because if you don't eat your own lunch, if you don't cannibalize yourself, someone else will. So you might as well be first to the party. Again, the same kind of analogy, right? You don't understand where the competition's coming from. You're just like a little frog that is waiting to be boiled. So again, back to the people who are behind these businesses. There are people in this world who really ask the question, why should I build this app? Why should I do this? Give me a good kind of rationalization. And there's other people who really say, why not? This is totally possible. No one's ever done it before. And I think, and I love ice hockey and kind of Wayne Gretzky and all his kind of analogies. And he gave this great quote, which is, a good hockey player plays to where the puck is, right? We know what the market's doing right now. It's fantastic. Let's build an app for this. But a great hockey player actually plays completely differently. He's like, wait a second, I'm going to anticipate where that puck's going to be. I'm going to build for something that's slightly in the future. But even that kind of rather trite example doesn't mean anything in this world of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and those guys, right? They don't play fair at all, right? They actually changed the rules completely, right? They went in there and they melted the ice. They drained the rink. They changed the entire game, right? These guys have basically said to a lot of incumbents that are out there, they said, look, we don't care whether you're number one. We don't care whether you've got a huge existing business. We don't care whether you're like Nokia or BlackBerry, who are huge leaders in the world. And can you even believe that in 2010, BlackBerry was still a leader in mobile, right? 2010, 3 years after the iPhone came out, or 2.5 years, they were still leaders. And this is all really relevant because of these two guys. Anyone know who those two guys are? So they kind of, for 20 years between them, worked at Yahoo in the basement. They were sysops guys. They kept the servers up. They weren't particularly happy, didn't have a good complexion, weren't particularly fit. They got bored and they left Yahoo and they sort of went and interviewed at Twitter and Facebook and got rejected, so they got a bit upset. Then they sort of really thought about what they could do, and they started thinking about building an app. And this was sort of circa end of 2007, 2008, and they're like, we're going to build an app. And like good engineers, and good frugal guys that actually saved up a bit of their own money, $200,000, which was quite cool. And Jan, one of the guys, he's like, look, I'm going to build this wicked app. It's all about telling people my status. It's kind of going to be like an address book, but it's going to tell other people whether I'm available or not. And you know what the real use case is? Me as a developer going to the gym, I really need to tell people that I'm busy and I'm not contactable at that time. You know, for those 15 minutes every week that I go to the gym, I want people to know I'm busy and I don't want anyone to contact me there. And lo and behold, the app sucked. You know, he built an iOS app and it wasn't very good. And he's originally from the Ukraine, and so he was trying to get his family and friends back in the Ukraine to be like, guys, come on, you know, play with my app. I need some downloads. And they're like, dude, it's kind of crap, but and it doesn't really solve any kind of use case for me. And by the way, we're in the Ukraine. You know, it's basically 3 years of salary to buy an iPhone right now, so that also doesn't make sense. He's like, okay, I'll think about that one. So he spent a good 9 months post-launch, iterating on this app, burning through his own money. And he listened to the users and they said, look, well, it'd be kind of cool if you could send a message through that status update because that'd be a little bit more interesting, you know. Oh, okay, cool. Oh, and by the way, the only thing that's popular, you know, in 2008 over in Ukraine is BlackBerry. Can you make this work with a BlackBerry? And he's like, oh, I don't want to make it work for a BlackBerry. I live in Silicon Valley and that's, you know, no one likes BlackBerries there. They're like, make a BlackBerry app. He hired a guy off freelancer.com, made a BlackBerry app, changed it up a little bit, and in the first 2 weeks of relaunching the app, he got 200,000 downloads. Okay, if you haven't seen that app icon, you've probably been asleep for the last few years. If you look at the growth rate of what they were able to achieve in the first 4 years, right? This guy had timing. It wasn't about iOS at all. The use case that it ended up being was people wanted to send international SMS messages. That's where it started. And why? In the US, it's always been relatively cheap, not mega cheap. But in the Ukraine, it was about 35, 50 cents, 90 cents, depending on the carrier, to send a text to someone in the US. That's ridiculous. So he started off with a model of, don't send free text, but for 99 cents for my app, I'll allow you to send text for life. And by the way, I'm going to support every single platform. The best case for cross-platform development that I've kind of heard ever. And it resulted in a business that for the first few years grew completely under the radar. One investor, Sequoia, under the radar, these guys were actually just barely cash flow positive. So they basically didn't need to go to investors, so investors couldn't screw them over and take a huge chunk of their company. And I thoroughly encourage everyone to not take money unless you absolutely need it, because no one wants to be at the beck and call of investors who, for the majority, not the smartest people in the world, certainly not technical, and all they really want is a chunk of your company and money at the end of the day rather than create something good. But what he was able to do is create a business that at the time it was sold was 50% bigger than all the world's SMS volume from all the carriers. And that was 30 billion SMS messages a day. And this is the interesting bit, is that it actually wiped out or saved people, depending on what side of the fence you sit, $386 billion worth of value. Now that's cool, because I'd rather save that money than give it to the telcos, because they certainly don't deserve it, because they can't even provide internet connections that are reliable and they keep dropping my calls. But the most fantastical thing about this business, when it was sold for this ridiculous amount of money, there were only 57 guys in a pretty crappy office above a pizza joint in Palo Alto. And they sold for $21.8 billion, which was 15% of Facebook's market cap at the time. And here's the wonderful thing as well, too, is the kind of, I guess the irony or the poetry of the whole situation is when Jan signed that final contract, he actually signed it on the wall in Palo Alto next to the first place, or one of the first places that he went as a young child, because he actually grew up in Palo Alto. And it was one of those employment offices where you pick up basically social security checks. So he came over as an economic refugee, effectively, and had absolutely nothing. His family and him took him all the way through, and he's actually given billions to charity, which is actually quite nice, and hasn't changed much since he's gone through this. But that level of utility today is frankly impossible to create. But what is absolutely possible is still creating things that people love. And mobile apps are still super interesting, but they're probably, today, part of something a bit bigger and something a bit different. And wearables are a particularly interesting one. And this company, the Fitbit guys, represent more than 50% of all the market with just their devices. And that's a really interesting kind of advantage. And they've got about 30 million odd users. When they floated, they were worth $1.8 billion. And that was another really interesting quest. It took them many years to get off the ground, to develop a business that made any sense, to actually get the right timing. And they had a huge amount of resilience to kind of go through this process and turn this into a business. As we go forward with apps, this is a really interesting strategy that's been pushed forward by L'Oreal, is they actually have these disposable tattoos that you can actually put on your skin that when you scan them with an app, tell you whether you've been out in the sun for too long, your UV and infrared exposure. So, it's somewhat comical and it's an interesting kind of application, but think about what's happening next. In order to create something that's worth $1 billion, something that effectively touches 1 billion people, that is incredibly powerful and valuable to a huge amount of people, you need to think slightly ahead of the curve. And there are ideas like this that people are just beginning to pursue that could translate into something, quite interesting. So, the mindset of a lot of people kind of in this industry, and when you sort of think about a few of their stories, is really this one, right? And it's not it's not a new concept, right? Thomas Edison kind of really was the guy who championed it and took him so long throughout his career to ever become a success. Another superbly interesting example was Candy Crush. Who's played Candy Crush? Guilty pleasure. So, an interesting game. But the company's been around for 11 and a half, 12 years now. The company almost went bankrupt 3 times. The company went from being a purely web collection of games, which did moderately well, and they almost went bankrupt the first time in Christmas about 12 years ago, and almost had to fire everybody and got a last minute of injection of funds, but still didn't do amazingly well. The company then went through the whole history of Facebook apps. We remember Facebook apps and the whole Zynga generation of games. And, Zynga's not really what it was back in that day. But yet none of that actually worked. And it was still a relatively small company then. It was probably around 50, 60 guys making games. And we know how notoriously tricky games are. In its third iteration, again, right before Christmas, about 5 or so years ago now, they actually had 6 guys working on a game between their London and their Stockholm offices. And they created this game, which is the Candy Crush that we know today. 6 people, took them 3 months to build. They built in about 30 levels. And they put it in the App Store, and everyone in the company went home depressed that Christmas. They had nothing new in the App Store that was particularly interesting. No one had any hope or expectation for Candy Crush. And actually, no one checked the analytics until about mid-January. I think it was actually the 3rd week of January. Being good Swedes, and Riccardo, one of the co-founders, is Italian, so he likes to go on holidays. No one checked the analytics. They checked the analytics in the 3rd week of January, off the charts. 6 people, 3 months of work. No one could even vaguely explain the success of this game. But what do? They had years of experience of really farming out games, doing distribution. They started throwing money at it. They started throwing people at it. They started, optimizing everything in terms of their marketing spend and user acquisition. And they ended up having right now an 18-person full-time performance marketing team. And it generated, I think again last year, about $2 billion in gross revenue. The amount of perseverance you need to get there is just something utterly phenomenal. And at the end of the day, it's really, about the people that are in this company and what is their mission? Why are they trying so hard to actually succeed and build these things into businesses? And, one of those kind of notions is, and I think what really differentiates the people who actually succeed in these companies is really, what are they actually doing? What are they actually getting up every morning to actually fulfill? And a huge amount of them are actually working on the self-esteem and kind of self-actualization level. when you talk to Ricardo at Candy Crush, his mission, as fickle as it may sound to the rest of us, he loves entertaining people and making them happy. He wants to actually fill in that 30-minute train journey or your commute to work, or that 15 minutes that you're sitting on the toilet, not reading a magazine and playing a casual game. That's what he derives pleasure from, and it has actually allowed him to kind of drive this business. I think one of the challenging aspects that we also have everywhere in the world in order to compete today, and again, this is completely different to even how the world was 5, 6, 7 years ago, is that money is an issue, and people are quite challenged, and innovation is necessarily about how much money you can throw at a problem as well. And this is actually what kind of separates Silicon Valley and real businesses and the whole innovation cycle of being able to reinvest in itself. When you look at these kind of numbers and ratios, these are per employee numbers. I think they're fascinating benchmarks. I think the ones at Apple are extraordinarily complex to compare to anyone else because of the kind of hardware quotient that they have involved there and the premium pricing. But the fact that they keep oscillating between number 1, 2, or 3 of the most valuable company in the world is extraordinary. But when you look at the other tech companies, making upwards of 500,000 or $1 million per employee creates so much fundamental profitability that their ability to reinvest in other businesses, their ability to acquire other businesses just purely for talent, starts making this tech cycle quite different. And again, these companies weren't that big 5, 6, 7 years ago. Facebook just had its 10th anniversary. Google's been around, mildly longer, right? About 15, 16 years. But the world and the ecosystem has changed about where we need to compete and create something new. I think one of the interesting examples I give to big companies is this differentiator between superstars and 10x employees. And these are the guys that really exemplify a lot of the stories, whether it be Snapchat or WhatsApp and internally, and their ability to actually execute and fundamentally drive difference. Who's heard of T-shaped individuals or T-shaped personalities? So a handful of people. I think this one's really, really interesting because T-shaped people are those people who've got really deeply analytical skills, but also that broad ability to work with other disciplines across the company. When you look at how WhatsApp was able to succeed with 57 people, the majority of whom are engineers, they're not engineers who go sit in a corner and just do their own stuff. These are guys who know how to play as a team. They're guys who actually appreciate the end user. They're guys who appreciate a business model. They're guys who appreciate what a network effect is and how to make everything work together. They're hugely team players. And again, the organization of these kind of small teams of individuals all kind of working together, compounded with the fact that you're actually giving them huge world-changing problems, is actually what's driven the fundamental part of a lot of these billion-dollar apps, which allows them to, again, kind of drive that big impact. And here's the kind of really interesting kind of way that some of these kind of personalities are kind of driven up is, I've always seen, comparisons of pessimistic and optimistic personalities, but the bit that I haven't seen it compared to is people who are both skeptical and credulous. And let's look sort of an example of this is the people who are optimistic but kind of believe that anything is possible are the guys who are, they're working hard, always happy, but they'll also believe that they might be able to have, a one-man spaceship and to land on the moon sometime in the near future. They're also guys who kind of believe in, a Tony Robbins, self-motivating talk being worth $5,000, for 2 days worth of work. But the people who really succeed are the ones who are eternally optimistic and believe something's possible, but actually quite skeptical. And these are the entrepreneurs who actually go in there and they're like, well, wait a second. We know we can build self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles and change the world of transportation, but how do we actually get back to the root problem that we can solve today? How is my app going to really get traction and differentiation compared to the other guys today and actually drive that business forward in logical, hugely concrete steps? And I think that's really important because that attitude really begets, the following. Things are difficult but possible as opposed to possible to difficult. They're guys who are much more into the gain than the pain, impossibilities versus possibilities, right? And that's the big difference. I think one of the other really interesting, billion-dollar tech companies out there that again has, actually right now a majority of their traffic and revenue going through mobile is Airbnb. But more importantly is the attitude that I think a lot of us can learn from as we kind of build our own companies and our own technology from Silicon Valley. And 90% of their employees say it's the greatest place that they've actually ever worked. And that isn't just Americans drinking the Kool-Aid in San Francisco and believing a whole bunch of hype and waffle. They've actually made a very concrete strategy internally to believe their tagline of belong anywhere. They actually started with that externally and got a huge amount of employee feedback saying, well, why aren't you investing equally in employees? If we're working so hard for this amazing company, why isn't culture so amazingly important to you here as well? And one of the things that they changed is they got rid of the whole concept of HR and human resources. They didn't even call it the chief people officer. Airbnb were the first ones to actually come up with the concept of a CEO. And they've actually fundamentally re-architected their company. And this again is highly experimental, but how do I actually make people want to hop, skip, and jump into work so that they can continually innovate and think of great, new, amazing ideas? Google is incredibly well known for that internally, especially around engineers. Even though they don't have the 20% employee experimentation time anymore, those kind of things fundamentally make a huge difference. But all these things are worth remembering as you start creating a company from scratch. There's only so far today that you can actually get with a small team that is working lamentably hard and extraordinarily long hours without actually focusing on culture. And one of the most other fascinating kind of changes, and this is true in the US right now, and in the next sort of few years it'll be true all over Western Europe as well, is this attitude is also not only reflective of companies needing to keep employees and actually completely change their relationship with them, but it's also absolutely fascinating because Generation X and millennials have completely changed and distorted the nature of how companies kind of innovate and build amazing businesses. So I think that the 3 points that I kind of want you to kind of remember from all of this around sort of highly successful mobile businesses is, mobile, it is much more the data. Whether it's the data in terms of audiences or views or people's behaviors, that is the differentiating factor that allows you to create not just an app anymore, something that just has a bunch of interactivity and engagement, but something that is fundamentally a huge business that has profit and sustainability. And one of the only known paths to that right now that is even changing in terms of cycle time is auto-cannibalization. If you're not consistently reinventing your product, your business model, someone else will. I think also really interestingly, whether you use the example of Facebook or Google or Uber, data allows you to see real people's behavior. It also allows you to see their intent. Google is possibly the best engine of that. There's a great book called The Intent Engine, which is how Google really predicts en masse around the world what people are searching for before it actually happens. Before something's in the news, Google knows. Google knows who's getting more and more traffic before anybody else because they can find it from all their search queries. So again, utilizing that same concept from your data, understanding users and their intent, not just their current behavior, is a way to really write the future. And I have to say, the last bit is that apps is just the concept of building apps, I think, is dead. Right? I think the market is mature. I think it's saturated. I think people have fundamentally chosen what they want to do in a mobile kind of context. That having been said, think of opportunities that are much more around mobility, around what's coming next, that exploit the things that we've learnt in mobile, Because for sure, we're going to have virtual reality, augmented reality, in ways that we probably don't really even understand yet, but in ways that are probably vastly simpler than anyone thinks. When you look at stuff like Snapchat lenses and Snapchat glasses now that allow you to take 10-second videos or snap photos, that could be the right product at the right time. So for those of you who don't know, Snapchat has launched a pair of glasses that are wireless, that connect to their app on their phone. You can take photos with them, but they're at a price point, unlike Google Glass, which was a couple $1,000, they're $139. They're actually targeted to an audience around entertainment and preserving memories, and it works with an app where the fundamental behavior is already taking photos and videos every single day, and more than 150 million active daily users. But the bit that's really interesting about that is they're doing face recognition, they're doing face tracking technology. They just bought a small UK company that allows you to scan your face in high fidelity 3D detail by using a smartphone effectively as a scanning device. And the tech is phenomenal. They're buying PhDs all over the place. So already these companies that started off as principally app mobile companies are transitioning to a slightly different world, but exploiting all the data that they've got from that place. And if you're interested in any of the real stories behind that, then don't hesitate to have a look at the book. Do we have time for questions at all?
Yeah, sure.
Cool, so that's officially it. How about some questions? There's got to be one somewhere lurking on a Friday afternoon. There we go.
Okay, yeah. So you talk about data being the important bit, but I think a lot of people, myself included, when we build our apps, we try and save as much data as humanly possible. Do you have any recommendations for how we can take that and make some action out of it? Because right now, I've got SQL tables full of stuff. But how do I turn that into something that's profitable and useful within the business?
Well, that's the ultimate interesting question, right? Is, yes, absolutely collect the hell out of it. I think bringing in people who can transform whatever your use case is into something meaningful and actionable from there is really, the thing that's so case specific. And I think just thinking about that and being aware of it and trying to figure out what to do with that is so highly prized. And, I would use the example of, I was just talking to some guys at Facebook about a month ago who's head of European advertising. And the guy was just banging the table saying, I want a goddamn app that's got a whole pile of users that gives me real-time location information. Because right now, Facebook only has about 40% of mobile devices that actually give them access to mobile information. And they've just launched a part of their advertising API that allows you to basically match up someone's location down to kind of the millisecond when they're actually browsing, so you can now match ad views to someone's location and match whether it actually changed their intent in order to go walk into a clothing store, for example. So you can match all this right now, but they've got this sort of missing chunk of data. But what they're able to do with machine learning is actually, to about a 70% degree of accuracy, estimate where you were at any one time based on swarm-like behavior of individuals and also your location history. But that is absolutely the direction that they're going, because they're actually trying to capture a huge amount of offline display spend and push that into their business. Anyone else? Cool. Well, pleasure being here, and I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon in Zurich. Thank you.
Everything for you? I guess we have to send them via the post.
Yeah, I think
Very nice.